Hey folks, Eric here. I recently released a Pico 8 project, and it was my first original Pico 8 game. I'll put the link down in the description. You can check it out. It's on the BBS. I'll put it up on itch as well. And I was working on it kind of on and off for the better part of a year. Not constantly because it wasn't that long of a project, but sporadically on nights and weekends. But because I was working on it over the course of such a long time, it evolved quite a bit from what I had originally started with. And so I thought it would be cool to do a devlog where, because I did the whole thing in Git, I can go back to older commits and show you kind of the different ideas that I had and how I landed on the final game. So what we're looking at is actually the first commit in the repository, and I'll link to the repo in the description as well, so you can actually just clone this and check it out yourself. And I originally had this kind of outer space idea where I had a spaceship, and the main thing that I wanted to play around with was actually built around gravity. And so this is supposed to be like a meteor, although I've called it Space Cheerios because I thought it kind of looked like a busted Cheerio. But anyway, the spaceship needs to get these fuel canisters and avoid the obstacles. And I implemented like a really basic gravity system. So if I push the button, you can see the Space Cheerio starts to move towards where the gravity was. You can do that again, speed it up a little bit. And the closer I am, the faster it goes, and it starts to kind of ricochet around the screen. And if I get the fuel, it kind of respawns somewhere else. So this is just like the most basic version of what I had in mind, which was something to play with gravity and create a bunch of chaos on the screen. And that chaos sort of inspired the working title of the game for a while, which is the Entropist or Entropy. One thing that I realized is I implemented like a title screen or a start screen in this game like really early. This is like what I'm looking at right now is the next commit in the sequence. And like I totally did not need to put a title screen in here, and it really slowed down my testing because every time I restarted, I had to just go past the title screen. Anyway, so I think at this point I was kind of showing it to a couple of friends, and so I put some basic instructions on the title screen here. So we're going to get these fuel canisters, these jerry cans, and avoid the asteroids, and also use gravity to sort of manipulate the field. So you can see I've added a time limit. I added some collision with an invincibility flash so the ship can bounce into the little meteors here. And if we use the gravity here, we'll notice it'll pull those meteors and a little bit of the fuel canister. And things start to get a little bit bonkers as I pull more and more stuff. It gets harder and harder to stay alive. And what I had kind of envisioned at this point was like a bunch of different levels where you have to be very careful about where you're going to make your little gravity wave because it can create a whole bunch of chaos. So you have to be sort of strategic about where to use your powers and think about the impact it's going to have on the level around you. Now the aesthetic started to change pretty early. This is the first appearance of what ended up being the final kind of character sprite. I sort of had the idea to do sort of a mad scientist situation where that person could play with gravity. And so you can see that rather than the gravity being centered around the ship as it was in the previous examples, now you can kind of position it on any side of you. Although the meteor and fuel can aesthetic remains. And clearly I don't have any sort of idea of like death here. The meteors just kind of bounce off the player and sometimes get stuck on them. I also did add multiple levels here, as you can see. But otherwise, it's quite similar to the old one, just a slightly different aesthetic. So this is where things started to change pretty significantly. You can see I've updated the map graphics a little bit to go from nothing to this sort of room. I have wall collision going, and I have a slightly nicer player sprite. Now with the gravity mechanic, the idea I had here was that you couldn't grab these items directly. This little purple cube thing is sort of supposed to be the item that you have to get to clear the level. You can't actually pick them up directly. You have to use the gravity to pull it towards you and get it into the sort of gravity well. So if you put it too far away, it'll miss and kind of just the gravity will disappear before the item falls into it. You have to do it close enough that it falls in and creates this. The idea here I had was it would create like a wormhole. The gravity would reach a sort of critical mass, right? And that would be how you beat the level, is you had to get a bunch of mass into this gravity well. And as it grew bigger and bigger, it would attract more and more mass and sort of like, again, create more chaos around the level. So this is sort of an extension on the previous idea. What I did here is I sort of limited the number of times you could use gravity, or it would work until you trapped an item in it and created like a wormhole. So if I use it down here and I pull this item into the gravity well, it'll create like a persistent wormhole right here. That was my idea for the wormhole. And hopefully now my player no longer has the ability to use gravity, right? I've sort of like committed myself to creating my wormhole here. But you can see it's too far away to pull this other item to it, so it doesn't finish the level. So if I start this again, and I want to position the gravity here, I can sort of create the wormhole close enough that it will also affect the other item, and it will pull in all the items in the level, and that will be the condition that clears the level. I sort of gave up on this route because the level design just seemed like it was going to be really hard. And probably like if you could only create one persistent source of gravity, that would really limit the level design quite a bit. So I gave up on this idea pretty quickly. And instead, you can sort of start to see shades of the final title here. I decided that you would have to use the gravity to also move obstacles out of your way. And you can see I've gone with like this concentric circle graphic for the gravity now. Now in the player's way, there's this block and you have to use the gravity to pull it out of the way. Again, you can sort of see some of the mechanics in this one already. And also I had kept the wormhole and use it to be sort of a flight mechanic. So you have to throw the wormhole towards something and then you can release your grasp on the land and it will pull your player towards it, right? And you can even pull yourself at different angles and things too. Let me see if I can move this out of the way like that. And then we'll throw the wormhole over here. And that's down here. You can see he'll kind of move at an angle. There's no slide mechanic in this one. You can kind of just like stop and hit the ground. Also, the wormhole remains persistent. You can't like, it doesn't time out or anything. You have to pick it up to get it again. So the idea would be to move the boxes out of the way and then use the wormhole thing to cross gaps, and then you would reach the goal. You can see here I'm sort of iterating on the same idea. There's been a couple additions to this level. You can see the item makes a glorious return, and again, you can't pick up the item directly. You have to use gravity to get it. We'll move this box out of the way, and this blue rectangle is what later became sort of the electric beams in the final game. You can tell that they won't kill the player in this version. They're just kind of like a wall, and you have to pull the crate toward you to block that out of the way and then fly across towards the exit. So again, you can sort of see some of the ideas from the final game coming together here in a very primitive way. A little bit more iteration at this point. I thought it would be cool if you had some control over the landing when you use the floating mechanic. And so I introduced the sliding bit here. You can't control the direction of your slide, which makes it really limited. That was why I ended up adding the sort of, you can tweak the direction of your slide in the final game. But you can do some sliding stuff here. And also the wormhole will time out now rather than just waiting for you to pick it up. So if you accidentally put it outside the map, it wouldn't just like ruin your run. And I created like a slightly different version of the gravity. So I found that sort of circle gravity where you're creating a point source and pulling things towards you makes it just really chaotic. Like I know the original, or one of the original working titles of the game was like Entropy or the Entropist. But I found that it was just really difficult to do this sort of like puzzly type of game when you didn't have very accurate control over what you were doing with that gravity stuff. So that's why right now it's sort of this temporary green line thing. So rather than a point source, it's just pulling in stuff from all directions. This allows you to sort of target exactly what you want to put the gravity on. So it's like a tractor beam, I guess. I think at this point I probably did have the item breaking thing in. So if I try to pull this item, oops, apparently I also put deaths in. If I try to pull this item towards the beam will probably blow it up, right? But you can still block it with this guy. I should say here too is around this point where I allowed the player to just get the items directly rather than having to use the gravity to like absorb them. So that's back in. Also, you may have noticed that I have now added the ability to reposition boxes, and you'll see that it's a little bit janky depending on the direction, or rather like the angle that you grab the box at. The sort of rotation will be, the box isn't repositioned directly in front of you or directly to the side of you. It's sort of offset based on the initial position. I thought this was kind of cool at first because it's like the player is like swinging it around, but it makes it really difficult to think about as the player where your box is going to be, like land. Like if I needed to pick this box up and reposition it in front of the beam, if I didn't grab it exactly at the angle I needed it, it might not be able to be placed in such a way that it blocks the beam. So you'll see in the later game or in the finished game, I cheat really hardcore with this. So in this version, if I pull it from the base, right, the box is kind of like above me a little bit. It's kind of at this weird position. Whereas if I pull it dead on, it'll kind of come towards me dead on like that. In the final game, I cheat quite a bit. So even if you pull it from like way down here or way up here, it jumps to your position. So you can like have some sense of where you're going to position it when you drop it. I thought that was just like a lot more player friendly to do it that way and a lot more fun, frankly. So this leap was mostly a visual one. I spent quite a bit of time working on the tile set to make it look halfway decent. I also updated the graphics for the gravity beam. This is pretty close to what the final ended up being. And the wormhole still exists as sort of this concentric circle flashy thing. And again, rather than in the final game where you just sort of float, this allows you to first throw the thing and then sort of float towards it at some angle. I actually kind of like this mechanic still. It didn't end up being like this in the final game mostly because it was just too many button presses, right? In order to complete this full action, I have to press it once to throw, once to take off, and once to land. So it's like 3 presses just to do the one thing, which is like fly. And I just found that to be too many, which is why I took out the wormhole and just had it be a regular float. Also, you can see like the items are starting to look a little bit more like the final version. Collision is still a little bit janky, and the box repositioning is still kind of actually quite janky. But there's levels now, and this kind of resembles one of the final levels in the game. So again, mostly an aesthetic iteration here. Okay, in this version, you can see on the bottom the sort of colored squares, the green, blue, pink, and yellow. That's because there are 4 items, one of each color. And I think, if we grab this guy, probably the green box will fill itself in. Yeah, great. And I also started to play around with the idea of having the beam and the wormhole thing be sort of pickups that you would have to get. So this one, although I already have the beam here, this one would have been like the beam pickup and would let you use the beam. Also, you can see the ability to reposition boxes is now pretty much in its final form. So even if I go down to the bottom and try to like get this box from down here, it'll sort of cheat and jump to the player's position so that now I know exactly where I'm going to reposition the box. And I added that dotted line effect so that it was quite obvious visually where the box would be placed when you let it go. The gravity beam changing color, I think I did this mostly for debugging purposes, but when it's normally like this purple and pink color, but when you grab something with it, it changes to a blue. Also, you can't hear it, so I've spared you the sound effects, but I did add some sound effects for the sort of beam at this point. Okay, some slight changes in this version. I sped up the wormhole, so it flies a lot faster. I also added sliding controls, as you can probably see there. So that's cool. And they work pretty much like the final version, I think. I definitely tweaked the sort of different velocities and stuff, but mechanically it works about the same way. I also, let me get the beam here. I added some particle effects, as you can see when I hit the wall or this box, it leaves a trail of particles. And also when I pick up this item, there's some like sparkles in the inventory like that. So I got really into particles for a little while, and some of that ended up in the final game. Also, again, I'm sparing you the sound from Pico 8 itself, but there's like a very basic music track in the back here. So I guess I spent a lot of time around this commit working on the visual style and a little bit of the audio. Okay, and then in this version again, now we're getting actually quite close to what would be the final version. You can see some aesthetic changes, right? The black outline around things, the final version of the item graphic and the way that the item moves up and down. And also we have these inventory items. So even though I already have the beam because I have debug mode enabled, this would be like the pickup that would enable you to use the beam. An early version of level 2 here. So yeah, things are starting to come along, and this is also the final version of the music track was in this version of the game. If you want to hear what it sounds like, I would recommend you just play the game itself. Okay, the biggest change here, and again, you can really start to see the levels taking shape here. This is very, very similar to what the final version of level 1 looked like. The biggest change in this one, though, was implementing moving beams. So I've had these beams like in the game since pretty early on, as we saw. And I realized as I was working out some level designs, it would be really interesting if the beams could move around, and it introduced this sort of reactionary mechanic where the player either had to hurry through something like this, or to very quickly like reposition a box to save themselves from getting hit by a beam. So those moving beams, there's only one level in this particular commit, but those moving beams were a pretty late addition, but one that really, I think, opened up the level design possibilities. Okay, and this is pretty much the final version. You can see I've made some changes to the way that the beams look, so they look more like electric-y. I did a whole devlog on that, actually, if you want to check that out. And the biggest mechanical change here was changing from the wormhole where you had to throw the thing and then it would pull you towards it to just the floaty bit, which ended up in the final game. And again, I did this mostly just to reduce the button press to do that particular verb, right? That float verb, because I felt like as I was trying to just blow through these levels as fast as I could to test them, it would occasionally be a real pain in the neck and like not fun to have to press the same button 3 times in rapid succession, especially in some of the later levels where beams are like moving all over the place and you have to be pretty quick with your reactions if you're trying to get through the game quickly. So yeah, I found that the way that I was trying to play my own game informed the design around some of the mechanics. Like there was things that were annoying me, and so I took them out or I changed them. I guess that's kind of cool. Like the way I had envisioned it originally, when I actually sat down and played it in different ways and played it, I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of times, I realized that certain things would not work if you tried to play the game in a certain way. And that's why that particular mechanic was changed. So yeah, you can see there's still some things that are a bit different here. The inventory looks a little bit different. And also there's like just some, you can consider those red dots to be like debugging graphics. I just need to see where the gaps were. But yeah, this is more or less the final version. So it really came quite a long way from that first version. So yeah, just going back to what was the original, I mean, not the first commit we looked at, but you know, a very early one, and the closest thing to what you might recognize as something like a game with clear objectives. You know, it obviously changed quite a bit, and the only constant, I guess, was this idea of using some sort of gravity feature to mess with the environment. I would say that, you know, the beam feature was mostly about creating or changing the environment in a way that it made the level possible to beat or just easier to beat. And then the floating mechanic was there just to make it more fun. You'll notice the float is like faster than the walk, and makes a fun little noise, and the player sprite kind of looks like he's enjoying himself. So yeah, like there was this gravity mechanic, and then the floating mechanic was kind of like, well, let's just make this thing like feel more fun to play. And that was how the final version came about. So yeah, I hope that was kind of cool to check out, to see how like an idea changed over time to become what it was. The final game is, as I said, up on the Lexaloffle BBS, and also on itch.io, or itch.io if you prefer. It's completely free. If you have Pico 8, you can get it through Splore. If you have Pico 8, you know how to do that. If not, just go to the link in the description and check it out on itch. It only takes probably 5 minutes to play through the first time, and on repeated playthroughs, you should be able to get through it in like a minute or two. So it's really, really short. Check it out if you have a chance, and let me know what you think. And thank you for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed this little devlog, and I will catch you all soon. Thanks again.